It's been some time. It's been an honor writing to you, to a lot of you, and speaking to a lot of you, and mentoring some of you and coaching some of you for the past year. It's all a bit strange the way it started. I expected Blood and Rain to be an open journal. Expected it to be just a public documentation of my returning to a path that I had abandoned. Many of you who followed from the very beginning, many of you who followed and read the posts and heard the early podcasts, you'll know I had no intention of showing my face. This was something that was really for me, but I also thought could be of service to others. So I put it out there. I didn't really expect to get this many people giving this kind of feedback. I also didn't expect to meet so many like-minded people, many of whom are still anonymous. Letters from the Ruins, Nature Chad, Totally Not Anacreon, and some people who have shown their face, like Forrest Munden, Will Spencer from the Renaissance of Men, KJ Says Words, all these guys. I thought the words, whether they were written or spoken, if they were good enough, that they should be words that hold up on their own. They shouldn't be listened to because of the way I look, or not listened to for the way I look. They should just be out there. And if they're words worth reading and they're words worth listening to, then they'll be read and listened to. And you've been reading and listening, which means the work was worth it. Still, over time, it became less and less apparent as to why I was anonymous. When I started Blood and Rain, when I started this iteration of Blood and Rain back in December of 2020, it was a strange time politically where if you had your face out there and you had an opinion that was against the grain, people didn't just go after you, they went after your loved ones. And I didn't want to drag my loved ones through the mud, so I thought it'd be a good idea to stay anonymous. I also had pursuits in real life where people do see my face and do meet me every single day, and I didn't want my writing to be tied to my face. I didn't want my speaking to be tied to my face. I wanted that creative life and that real life to be separate. I didn't speak to anyone really in my real life about anything I did on the page. I mentioned a few times, like, I kind of have this writing page I don't tell people about, and that was that. When I started this, I had lost both my jobs due to COVID-19 '84. Gavin Newsom shut down the bars and restaurants in California in March of 2020. I was quite furious. I threatened to leave to go to Texas in May of 2020, and just due to the political climate of what was going on in California, especially with the George Floyd protests, I wanted to make sure that I stayed put in California through that, through the election, to protect my mother. My father is quite all right. He has quite a bit of means of defending himself. But my mother, I felt this inherent duty to stay and be in proximity of her. So instead of going to a place where I could work behind the bar and make bartender money, I decided to stay. And I never took unemployment. Unemployment goes against every fiber of my being. And I was yelling at people, feeling like the only sane man in the city of Oakland, about how all this COVID-19 before nonsense was indeed nonsense, but the hysteria was very high. And I was telling people that you shouldn't allow yourselves to be reliant on the government. So if I'm saying that to people, how can I be a hypocrite and take money from the government? So I decided against it. And I decided to work an overnight security job 2 hours from where I lived. Commuted 2 hours each way via walking or running, taking the BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit, a couple buses to get to this job. And funnily enough, I had been off of a path, what I thought was a path tied to the name Blood and Rain, tied to the poem that I wrote almost 4 years ago now, thinking that was the path. But that path came from a faith that I had walked away from. And I knew I needed to be returning to something because I had become an absolute husk of myself. Upon walking away from the faith, I sustained a lower back injury. I sustained a series of tragedies that I felt were wholeheartedly deserved. And I didn't think they were wholeheartedly deserved because I walked away from the faith. I just quite honestly felt I deserved them. And right before Gavin Newsom shut everything down, I had the perfect job. I had the perfect pair of jobs, a perfect schedule. I was making quite a bit of money a month in order to train Muay Thai, to go back to competing, to not only compete in smokers, but to compete in amateur fights and be on the road towards becoming a professional. That was the goal. And I had this very strange moment with myself about a week before the shutdown happened, saying, you're not ready to bleed. You may have all this set up, you may have everything you quote unquote need, but you're not ready to bleed. And that's just unacceptable. And by the time I took this overnight security job, I kind of smiled to myself because I said, at least you're alive. At least you're struggling. And if you're struggling, there's a sign of life. You're not in some stupor. You're not in some safety blanket. And the first iteration of Blood and Rain, which is more of a personal account that came about in 2018 after I wrote the poem Blood and Rain, after my first Orthodox Pascha, which for those of you who are in Orthodox, Pascha is Easter. I had abandoned it. And, there was less things about training, there was less things about faith. It was just turned into a normal personal Instagram with memes and photos with me and my loved ones, and which is fine, but it's not what it set out to be. So I changed Blood and Rain to a different name, and I made a new account, Blood and Rain, which you all know today. And I said, okay, you're in this struggle. You're in this struggle that isn't even, glamorous. And when I say glamorous, I don't mean aesthetically pleasing. I mean, you're in this struggle that isn't anything really to write home about. It's no martial arts struggle. It's no hard labor struggle. You're just sleep deprived. You're commuting 2 hours each way to stare at a camera for 8 hours and do some rounds. the end of the day, it's really not that hard. It's just deeply mundane, but it's still gave me some kind of sign of life. The costs of living in the Bay Area were very high. So I had about $3,000 of monthly costs that I had to scale down. And even after scaling down, the security job wasn't cutting it. So one of the very few conservative towns in the Bay Area, I took a brunch bartending job on the weekends. My weekends between the overnight security job and the bartending job and the brunch shifts on the weekends, I was having 40-hour weekends. I was commuting 2 hours to San Francisco to do my overnight security job Friday night, 10:30 to 7. Then I was commuting from San Francisco to this other town for about 40 minutes, and then working 10 to 5. And I was going back to San Francisco to work 7 to 7, back to the other town to work 10 to 7, and then back to San Francisco again to work 8 p.m. to 7 in the morning, Monday morning. I was incredibly sleep deprived. The bar shifts were busy. I was fatigued. I was caffeinated to the gills. I was angry. But there was a sign of life there. There was a struggle there. I said, okay, maybe you can earn the right to train again. Maybe you can earn the right to be able to train. Because right now everything's shut down, but maybe, just maybe, you can do something. A roommate of mine acquired a bench and a barbell, and we decided to make weight plates out of concrete. I didn't have a level surface to squat on, so I squatted on a slanted driveway. I would pound multiple bangs or reigns, which really I couldn't afford, and blast things like Wish by Nine Inch Nails into my headphones while being absolutely furious. Running parallel to this, I started to say to myself, well, if you can't really fully train right now, what you only have these barbell exercises, you can't really, obviously you can't spar, you don't have a bag, you can really shadow box. When you have all the resources available to you, you should be able to train yourself, so you should be diving deeper into sports science. My gateway drug into sports science properly was Pavel Tsatsouline, who many of you will know for his works like Enter the Kettlebell, the Easy Strength book that he wrote with the American trainer Dan John, among other texts. But this is a gateway drug to study papers from Soviet sports scientists. I also began to study conditioning methods both for MMA fighters and for soldiers, in addition to diving further into the movements of old-time strongmen like the men of Arthur Saxon, George Hackenschmidt, Eugene Sandow, Alan P. Mead, and so on and so forth. And I started to read about the principles of training. And with the barbell on the slanted driveway and very shaky bench, I started to figure some things out. It's funny, I was a lot happier while I was struggling than I was when I was making all this money bartending and had the perfect schedule for training. I was happier sleep deprived. I was happier. I was happier suffering. So at least I was sort of pulling this muck off of me. And I said, okay, well, now that you're sort of alive, now that you're actually struggling, now actually doing something, now Now that you're training, now that the gyms are open, this is kind of fall 2020. Gyms had opened back up briefly. Um, Maybe you can start to think about doing something with blood and rain again. Maybe this can actually, you can actually do the page of justice. Maybe you can actually document your path, with this philosophy, with this poem that you wrote. And you can put it out there, and that can be that. Um, I started training, started getting much, much stronger when the gyms opened back up, had access to more equipment. With the central nervous system weightlifting, I was reaching new PRs, but with much less effort. Um, my conditioning was up, despite being malnourished and sleep deprived consistently throughout 2020 and throughout most of 2021. Just not really being able to afford food. My best friend and I would go through some Wendy's drive-thrus. We'd eat some horrendous chicken breasts from Walmart. Sometimes we'd splurge at a Sprouts and get raw milk, but even that we'd feel. It was what it was. So the muscular system wasn't the best. Physique wasn't the best. I was kind of this dirty bulk going on. But we're getting stronger, getting faster, getting more conditioned in terms of the cardiovascular system, in terms of the muscular system, and it was all right, cool. And we're doing this, or I'm doing this rather, while I'm sleep deprived and malnourished. That means this is working. A gym opened back up, a martial arts gym I had moved to a certain town for briefly before a second shutdown that winter. I had rehabbed the lower back injury to a point that I thought was acceptable to train again from Muay Thai. But upon the first, or the second bag class back, I re-injured my lower back just kicking a heavy bag on November 11th in 2020. Which is demoralizing, but I was at a point where I said, that doesn't matter, I'm going to come back and still train. And I'm going to come back and still compete. Despite now being 2 years, 2 years deep into a lower back injury that kept hindering me. I was able to lift weights around it. Wasn't able to really max squat. I wasn't really able to max deadlift, despite the working sets getting higher and higher and higher. I wasn't able to kick full torque after that second injury. And then they shut down the bar job, so I was back to having less income, and I had to pick up as many extra security shifts as I could. This is December 2020 now, and this is when I started writing on Blood and Rain. I was like, okay, well, you may not be able to train as much as you want to, so that part of the documentation you can't really have on Blood and Rain, but you can start writing, and that's the other thing that you love to do, is write. So I started writing, and it started to be well received. And on the Great Conjunction, the winter solstice of 2020, this is something that many people in this sphere of the internet have spoken about. Myself, Nature Chad, Forrest Munden, Flo Modus, Evil Academy, Nature Pill, you name it, everyone. We all sort of found each other at this time. And I literally, on a whim, in a story, I said, what you can expect from this account next year. 2 posts a day. Training logs. And what a podcast. Why not? I saw that Forrest Munden had put out a podcast, and I always assumed podcasts were for people who, already really, quote unquote, made it in something. They established themselves in something. And, Forrest had a lot to say. And, Forrest is still figuring things out just like the rest of us. And I said, okay, well, I've got a few things to say. I was an actor once upon a time, so might as well start a podcast. Didn't have this very nice mic. I had an iPad that I was shouting at with a rain track in the background on Christmas of 2021, January 7th. And that's how the podcast is born. I remember lingering in the background through all my struggles in 2020. When I would take the bar back and forth from the security job to the bar job to the security job, there was a song that I'd play in my headphones that would help me sleep despite it being daylight. It's called Return to by Max Richter off of an album literally called Sleep. And I found this solace in it, the fact that it would help me sleep in the first place. But there's something a bit beyond that where I felt this lifeline that was external being handed to me, asking me to literally return. Return to what? Well, I thought it was the path, quote unquote, the path of blood and rain, but this was a return to Christian faith that I had abandoned for all the wrong reasons in 2018. And the podcast obviously started on Christmas, Orthodox Christmas. And I felt those lifelines continually being thrown my way by God to return to the faith. But I couldn't get past the fact that I hated myself for leaving the faith. Something the writing was known for in its early posts especially was just fury. A lot of self-hatred that turned into fuels, some very Goggins-esque fuel. So I thought the world of David Goggins, and honestly still think the world of David Goggins. And a lot of really nightmare fuel schizo posting. When I say schizo posting, not sort of split personality, but the misuse of the word schizo, just intense. And, well, yeah, I was sleep deprived and still trying to train and commuting a bunch of ways and trying to write and caffeinated to the gills and malnourished. And I was like, okay, well, yeah, it's going to come out as intense. It certainly fueled that. So instead of returning to the faith, I spent January, February, March, April, June into July writing as much as possible, putting out as many podcasts as possible. March, bars opened back up. One of my old jobs from before the pandemic reopened. I didn't have both jobs back, just the one. The one that opened wasn't making very much money, but it's still the extra money I needed to get by. So I started pulling 2 all-nighters a week again for another 4 months to make ends meet. I knew I wanted to do some kind of online training business. I knew I had learned enough about sports science to help people. Neo-Libertate and Greater Myth were Nature Pill were people that I gave free programming to. I just needed some. I needed some people on Instagram who I knew. Some people that some people that a lot of Instagram followers would recognize to succeed using this programming. And thankfully they did. And not just thankfully because it's something I've been working on, but quite honestly, thankfully they did, because it's a blessing to see them succeed. If there's one thing that I've been most thankful for, writing and speaking and coaching, it's the fact that it's actually been of service to people. It's the fact that it's actually been of use to people. And my philosophy or really this again comes from the Christian faith. You read Matthew 6, this, that middle portion of the Sermon on the Mount. It speaks about how if you really want to give someone something, you just give it to them and that's it. You don't say, you don't hang it over their head. You don't say, look how many people I've helped. Obviously, when it comes to the fitness world, you're running a business, you need to share success stories to show the validity of your training, but in life, when you actually want to be of service to someone, you just act of service and that's it. Like, you give it, you release it, you don't hang it over people's heads. And that was kind of my philosophy with the writing over time. Like, it actually became less and less about me and what I wanted to express. And there were days where, like, stream of consciousness, I wrote this, right? I wrote some narrative piece. I wrote some piece that just came to mind on a bus ride. I wrote a piece that came to mind while I was working security shift. A number of things. But over time, really, it became about what people were responding to. A lot of people started DMing me asking for advice. A lot of people DM'd me asking for further clarification on posts, on podcasts, thanking for the posts on podcasts. And I said, okay, well, this is of some use. So I found that as a further reinforcement to be anonymous. It's just a place people could go, hopefully be inspired, hopefully be roused to action. I was beginning to lace more and more posts with orthodoxy, and when it came to Lent, I tried to take Lent very seriously in terms of my prayers, and attended Pascha. There was no Pascha in 2020, unfortunately, due to California really clamping down on churches. And there was faith returning in the background. The more I came back to the faith, the more quote-unquote blood and rain-esque posts came. Because that poem was gifted after my first Pascha, which is the greatest holiday of the year, the resurrection of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And it came to a point where finally, after a short trip to Seattle, I got news that my other bar job from before the pandemic was going to open back up. So there was a light at the end of the tunnel with all the overnight security shifts. And I moved back to Oakland. Things were closer. And I felt like, wow, this trial is over, and I've endured, and now I am ready to bleed. I am wholeheartedly ready to step in the ring and bleed. And that's something I hadn't had in a long time. And when I put in my 2 weeks of my security job, I actually finally allowed myself to realize that I had been pulling 2 all-nighters a week. I think something you subconsciously knew that I was, but wouldn't allow myself to know it consciously so I wouldn't collapse. And I picked up the other bar job, and I was back to making bartender money, and it was good. It was good, at least financially. It was good. The come down from all of that, sleep deprivation and malnourishment for a long time, I think was actually worse than the actual overnight security shifts themselves. I want to say the entire month of June, I I was just down for the count. I'd be sleeping all day, watching episodes of X-Files, watching fights, going to the gym a bit, but it was just, my body was saying I needed recovery. I was giving it all kinds of good nutrients finally. And come July, I started training in a new gym. And on Bastille Day in 2021, I said a prayer in front of San Francisco City Hall. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I was giving my life back to God. And this was the start of a series of much more beautiful events, honestly. Just blessings. A lot of trials, but still mostly blessings, because when you live life with God, yes, you pick up your cross every single day, you suffer, but the light is ultimately greater, so the blessings are actually always greater. If you're attuned to God, you understand that. I began to properly rehab my injury throughout July and throughout August, and began to start to dust off all the old cobwebs. Started kicking with power again. Hand speed came back. Conditioning came back. All these things came back. And come my birthday, August 17th, I had the first birthday that I was actually happy about. It's granted a true gift from God that day. And God always blesses us beyond our comprehension. And at this point, with the page, with the podcast, we're still, I mean, obviously, anytime I have a guest on, they have so much to say. So it's like, anytime I have a guest on, it's almost like I just gotta ask the right questions and then they serve the audience. Like, that's kind of, it's easy. I feel like the solo podcasts are a lot harder because, like, it's on me to say something of service, to say something of benefit. But there's a bit of a lack of direction because a bunch of things were taking shape with God, a bunch of things were transitioning. Very focused on training, and I was asked to test into a fight team. I began preparing for that in August throughout the month of September to test on October 5th. Yeah. And was one of 3 people out of 40 to pass. Which, after almost 3 years then of a lower back injury, poverty, malnourishment, sleep deprivation, an engagement broken off, which is truly for the best. I had made it back. And throughout every security shift, despite not being able to train, despite being injured, I knew I'd make it back. But I didn't know because I knew because God said so. That was another lifeline that He gave me. And after this fight test, I thought I would be moving to Thailand. I thought that was a natural next step. I'm not engaged anymore. At this point, I want to At this point, I thought I was going to have a fight career, a writing career, and then be a monk if the fight career didn't kill me. Uh, at this point, I wasn't praying to die in the ring. I was just praying for a long fight career and a blessed life as a monk. Had no plans of kids, had no plans of anything, just that. Um, and with that, I needed to return to the church. In returning to the church, I came to a cathedral in San Francisco called Holy Virgin Cathedral, which is the resting place of St. John Maximovich, the Wonder Worker. And I didn't know this until Nature Pill, Devin Medrano, told me this, but the Orthodox say that prayers of true repentance are prayers of tears. And I'm not much of a crier, but I found myself sobbing upon repentance at this morning liturgy, this Wednesday morning, where I pulled an all-nighter after a bar shift, was sick as a dog, it was raining outside, went to a coffee shop in Oakland, tried to warm up everything with a venti, some such mocha, walked downstairs to the bar. I saw that the bar train had been waiting in silence. It was the strangest thing. It was morning, it was rush hour, it was commuting, everything was full, there was one seat left. The doors had remained open, it was as if it was still. It was as silent as a crypt. You could hear nothing, which meant you could hear everything. No one was saying anything, no one was rustling a newspaper, no one was coughing. It was just silence. I caught this bar across the bay to San Francisco and took a bus from San Francisco from one end all the way to the other end to the outer Richmond, close to Land's End, where this cathedral sits. Came to it for the first time, repented, and sobbed for not returning sooner. And in that moment, I was fully surrendered to God. After 3.5 years apart. I thought I was returning to the path of blood and rain. I know I was returning to God, as God grants us all. And He shifted my life accordingly. One evening, around this time, I'd been contemplating about beginning jiu-jitsu training. I thought that potentially be as good at jiu-jitsu, if not better, as I was at Muay Thai, just from certain things people had told me about the sport itself. I had been reading Gordon Ryan's page. He posted that day about how before he even did jiu-jitsu, before he even started, he choked out a home invader that was trying to attack his dad, or someone who knew his dad, but that day was a home invader for some reason. And he put him in a rear naked choke about a year before he even started jiu-jitsu because he had seen someone on a UFC event put someone in a rear naked choke. I was praying about whether or not I should move to Austin to train with Gordon Ryan and John Danaher, or whether I should stay in San Francisco. And while I was thinking about this post and praying about it, I was in an Uber on the way to one of my jobs in San Francisco, and I was at a stoplight, and I saw a man, one of these crazed homeless men that I'm sure you hear about in the news, cut off a woman at a crosswalk and throw her onto the ground onto the sidewalk. And she started screaming, "Get off of me!" And I don't know if he was trying to rape her. I don't know if he was trying to murder her. I don't know if he thought she was something else because he was hallucinating. But I yelled at my Uber to stop the car. And I ran out. And I'm not a jiu-jitsu guy. And I got in his back and put him in a rear naked choke. And she was able to get out from under him, and she just sort of stood there. You know, a lot of people say it's fight or flight. Really, it's fight, flight, or freeze. And I looked up at her and I said, "Run, damn it, run!" And she started power walking instead of running for some reason. And he began foaming at the mouth, so I let go and he popped right back up because he's on meth or PCP or I don't know anything about drugs, but he's on some drug that has some serious stopping power. And I run back in my Uber because I still have a job to go to. We call the police, say he's kind of over on this street. I think it's Turk Street, somewhere in the middle of San Francisco. And I said, well, if there's any clear sign that I need to move to Austin and start jiu-jitsu, then there it is. But really, that was about me just being willing to get out of California. But in that moment, I knew I'd be moving about January, February. And I wanted to push it back to August because I had a good thing going with my church, I had a good thing going with my gym. I was helping my parents get in shape. I felt like I was being a good son. But I knew that, come February, it was time to go. It was announced early in the year, early in 2022, that I would be required to check people's vaccination status come February 1st. And I said, I've had family live under Perón, I've had family live under Castro, Mussolini, and Francisco Franco, and the Reign of Terror. And I said, I don't care what happens. I'm not checking people's vaccination status. I don't care. I don't care if I financially suffer. That's it. So I called all my bosses. I gave them my 3-week notice and said, I'm moving to Austin, Texas. My thoughts were that I'd bartend in Austin. It's good money there. And I would do that until I'd get some online businesses off the ground finally. And that would be that. And I would set roots for quite some time. Setting roots in Texas, the place that's open carry. I can be a complete martial artist. I can go back to training bladed combat. I can train Muay Thai. I can train Jiu-Jitsu with the absolute best. I can train firearms. It's cheaper. I can start putting money towards a homestead down the line. Because at this point, God had told me no about Thailand. God had told me that you were not to be a monk. God had told me that you were to be a husband and a father, and you will serve in this way. Your time alone is done. And around this time, this year, February 1st, notice my writing started to fade. I noticed my speaking started to fade. And I felt the call for God, obedience to God, to heighten. In my last service that I attended, my last liturgy at Holy Virgin Cathedral, there were a pair of monastics. And the Archbishop gave his homily at the end of the 2.5-hour liturgy about having the focus of a monastic spiritually even if we do not take the honor of being a monastic. And when he first mentioned being a monastic, this is something in the past that had convicted me and no longer convicted me now. But I saw these two, one male and one female monastic, in attendance at this liturgy, and I absolutely marveled at their spiritual focus. It took my breath away. And I said, I want that. I want that. That is what I want. But I'm not a monastic. God has made that clear. And on that day, God also made it clear, today is your last bartending shift, ever. When you move to Austin, you're not going to do such things. Your time making a living off of assisting and poisoning people is over. I had met many great people in the bartending industry. Many of them actually taught me how to be a better Christian. They taught me how to serve. They taught me how to be genuinely kind, time after time after time after time again, to people who didn't deserve it, to people who were loudmouth drunks, who were just plain and simple shooting up their mouths or acting like complete degenerates, or just, being rude to other customers, just what have you. But being genuinely kind and having a tireless work ethic. And there's the people who genuinely cared about my well-being. And it's very difficult to have this sort of day in and day out dichotomy of saying, you guys live a certain way. You guys take shots behind the bar. You go to other bars outside of work and drink your faces off. That's fine. I mean, it's not, but that's your choice. But that's not something I'm going to partake in. So I had to set very clear boundaries. These people who I actually deeply care for, and because not just because they deeply cared for me, but there's the people I deeply admired. But it's this dichotomy of saying, yeah, I learned all these amazing lessons. I grew so much as a person, but they are running out. The silver linings there are no more silver linings to be obtained. What remains is that all of this service, all these good conversations, all of this wisdom that's surprisingly shared at 1:30 in the morning in the final stretch is predicated on poisoning. You're making a living of poisoning your fellow man. No more. And on the bus ride across San Francisco, I had written a lot of programs for Blood and Train that were really, they did well for people. But it was the kind of thing where I wrote it and there, go ahead, have at it. Which is fine, but I had a longing to pour into my fellow man, specifically my fellow man. And right then and there, I posted a story about Blood and Train athletes. I wrote this story about how I wanted, a group of about 40 guys. I can realistically manage the programming and coaching of 40 guys, despite their physical pursuits. Whether you are a Muay Thai fighter, whether you are a strongman, a shot put athlete, a first responder, a soldier, a bodybuilder with the right mentality. It doesn't matter. I can coach, I can program for you, I can coach you both physically and mentally. But I wanted it to be this kind of brotherhood. I wanted to be this thing where I'd constantly be pouring in all the knowledge I had, all the experience I had, both as kind of like a men's coach, coaching men's groups, the kind of thing that Brendan Schmidt does, Masculine Revival, but have it being based on training and have that training affect other areas of life. And once all those areas of life are strengthened, going out and being servants to our fellow man. And it should be the kind of thing, too, that After a while, someone would outgrow, and someone would leave, and someone would found something else, and another person could come and take their spot, one of the spots of 40, and that would be that. I said, I'm going to make a living. I want my living based off of that. Shortly after this, leading up to now, I've come to a point where it's actually been placed on my heart by God through the intercession of someone I love dearly that it's high time I showed my face. There's no more reasons for anonymity. I've had friends advise me against this, particularly Thomas, Letters from the Ruins, and that guy's got a heart of gold, and he made a bunch of points that I had held pretty close to the vest for some time. I said, anonymity is power, and spreading certain information, that's certainly true. But I found that the most important thing for this page and this podcast and Blood and Train and coaching is that it's meant to be a service. And I don't think I can take that service any further in anonymity. I used to think that you could separate yourself from the work, like the best artists separate, like they're able to take themselves out of the work, the best writers. This is actually only something that's possible in acting, because you're actually trying to be someone else. But if you're putting work out, you're putting original work out, original creativity, whether it's a painting, writing, sculpture, what have you, you're going to be in it, whether you like it or not. And funnily enough, the people who have seen my face, the few before all this, have either pictured my face and likeness exactly as is, or have actually seen it in dreams, which is fascinating. So obviously I can't take myself out of the work. So what do I do with that? Well, I accept it for what it is. I accept the fact that there are people who DM me asking for advice, asking for guidance, asking for mentorship. Looking to me for some kind of guidance and leadership. And leadership and guidance isn't something that's supposed to be prideful, and that's kind of why I've sort of shied away from it. I'm typically a very private person. I'm typically very aloof, elusive, cryptic. I've been called all these things. It's like I'll give advice here and then sort of leave me alone. Like not in a rude way, just like I'm no one to follow. I'm not as far along where I want to be yet, but God has asked me to do this nonetheless. Plain and simple, really. I don't know what that entails. you know, the only thing I can think of is that people messaging me at least are people who need direct guidance, who need direct leadership, and leadership is a servant's role. And this is everything. The page, the podcast, the coaching, training, everything is meant to be a service to all of you. It's deeply humbling. It's a gift. It's an honor. I don't have everything figured out. Not by a long shot. No. But I've been through hell and back. Ish. I mean, what I went through is really that big a deal. Like, there are people who, I tell myself this all the time, if I felt bad for myself during all those trials, like, there are people burying their children somewhere. Okay, you have no problems. These aren't actual problems. But I've been through a lot, and it's taught me a lot. And I've studied a lot, and I've lost a lot, and I've come back from a lot. And it's all to the grace of God. And where I'm at now, I'm on a path in training. I'm on a path in coaching. I'm on a path towards marriage, towards fatherhood. Most importantly, I'm on a walk with God that is imperfect. And for whatever reason, both by many of your requests, through prayers, and through conviction, it seems that a lot of you would be better served by me if I wasn't anonymous. So here I am, ready to serve. What you want to hear about in writing, in speaking, what you want to be coached for, physically, mentally, in Blood and Train, or through a men's group that I'll lead, or through a Bible study that I'll lead. I'm at your service. Simple as. The only thing to say left now is glory to thee, our God, glory to thee. Good night. Good storms. Thank you.